Okay, guys, welcome back to World History, and we're still talking today about World War One. We're going to continue talking about the early days into sort of the middle times, and eventually, during today's lesson, if we don't run out of time, we'll talk about the United States' formal entry into the war. Why do I say formal? Because we had already been involved for years financially, and providing other capital, food, etc. So we had not officially declared war, but we were involved, and we were keeping a watchful eye on what was going on over in Europe. The majority or a vast majority of Americans up until right before we went in, um, the majority of Americans didn't want to go to war. I've said it quite a few times, but we'd been pretty steadily fighting since our birth as a nation, with periods of peace spread throughout. But the American people just did not want to get caught up in what George Washington called foreign entanglements. In other words, just let Europe and the rest of the world deal with Europe's problems, and we'll deal with America. But like I said, eventually that's going to full blown involvement is going to be more or less unavoidable. And we'll get into today, we're going to talk about if we get there in time, which I predict we will, we'll actually be reading President Wilson's plea or petition to Congress to declare war. So that's pretty cool. It's a long document. Well, not long, but longer than you guys like to read. So I'm going to read it with you. But first things first, just to recap, on the Western Front, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives are going to be lost. We talked about the Battle of Verdun, which was a crucial battle for the French versus the Germans protecting France. And then we talked about the Battle of Somme as well. 1 million dead, and the English slash French, so the Allies, gained 5 miles of land. So the Battle of Verdun, the battle lasted 11 months. 305,000 people died. Neither side gained land. Battle of Somme killed 1 million people, and England and France gained 5 miles. So this is just this trench warfare and these new weapons just created the perfect recipe for death and made it very difficult to advance. So people were dying really with no payoff other than to kill your opponent's soldiers. But if your soldiers are dying by the tens and hundreds of thousands, well, it's not a great strategy. This is not going to let us play this, so instead I've pulled it up. It's a short video. I pulled it up on YouTube, and we're going to watch it there.
Continued through 1915 and into 1916, when the generals decided to go back to their original weapon, their men. The River Somme, northern France, early summer 1916. Along a front 25 miles wide, a massive Allied army prepared to attack. Thousands of British Tommies, as they were called, would lead the charge, and they would follow one of the most intense bombardments in the history of warfare, an artillery barrage that would last an entire week. Battle of the Somme was about to begin.
There must be 1,000 guns if there was one. It was a terrible roar from morning till night. But the foolish officers said, "Tomorrow, boys, you'll be over the top, and don't worry," he says. "There'll be no trenches there. Our shells have blown to pieces. There'll be no Germans there. They're blown to pieces. All you have to do is to walk over and take those trenches. In fact," he says, "you'll carry your rifle like a bag." The Germans, after the shelling, they simply come out of the dugouts, grabbed their machine guns, and then waited for the Tommies. They just simply swathed them down, so they were cutting down grain. They didn't get 200 feet from the trench. One German machine gunner said, "I stopped firing because I was sickened by what we were doing."
It was the bloodiest day in British history. 20,000 men killed, 40,000 wounded. And yet, the day after, and for days after that, young men continued to be ordered out of their trenches and into near certain death. Poet volunteer Alan Seeger was killed on July the 4th. On the same morning, Ted Francis waited for the signal to go.
Officers are down below us in the trenches with a whistle, and when they blow that whistle, we're going to dash out of the trenches and make for this German trench. And it is in those few 4 or 5 minutes that we look at each other and say, "Oh, well, now I shall do this." Some were visibly shaking, some were crying. And of course, when the whistle went, we had to scramble over.
The Battle of the Somme would come to define the futility of the First World War. It went on for 6 more months at the cost of 1 million men. And at the end of it, the Allied armies had moved a grand total of 5 miles. The guns of the Somme were so loud and so insistent that they were heard across the English Channel in London, 150 miles away.
It's pretty that's pretty crazy, isn't it? And the fact that they can, I have no idea what's about to show, but I don't want to watch it. Um, it's pretty cool that they were able to interview an actual World War One veteran for that, and that they have the footage. I personally think that's really interesting. So let's keep going, shall we? So far, we've really just been talking about the Western Front. We mentioned Russia, which of course is to the east, but these two battles, Somme and Verdun, they were in the west. So, as war on the Western Front is claiming thousands of lives, both sides are sending millions more men to fight on the east. That area is a stretch of battlefield along the German and Russian border. So, there, Russians and Serbs battled Germans and Austro-Hungarians. If you remember, it was Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia that led the Russians to get involved, which led the Germans to get involved. So the war in the East was a more mobile war than that in the West, but like the West, Stalemates were also very common. Early fighting at the beginning of the war, Russian forces launched an attack into both Austria and Germany. By the end of August, Germany counterattacked and absolutely crushed the invading Russian army. They drove it into full retreat. Just from that attack, more than 30,000 Russian soldiers were killed. So Russia did not do well against the Germans. They really just did a little better against the Austrians. Russia forced the forces defeated, Russian forces defeated, excuse me, the Austrians actually two times in September 1914, drove them deeper into Austria. And it wasn't until December of that year that the Austrian army managed to turn the tide or sort of get back on top. Austria defeats the Russians and eventually pushes them completely out of Austria Hungary. So, why did Russia suffer such huge losses? Well, by 1916, Russia's war effort was about to collapse. Unlike the nations of Western Europe, Russia had yet to become really industrialized. Russia did not have the industrial or the factory capacity that their counterparts in Western Europe had. So, as a result of that, the Russian army was always short on food, guns, ammunition, clothes, boots, blankets, and stuff like that. Also, the Allied supply shipments to Russia were very limited by Germany's control of the Baltic Sea. It was hard for allies to get stuff to Russia because remember the German U-boats were sinking ships all across the ocean. Really the only real asset that the Russians had, the only advantage they had or positive trait was their numbers. How many people they had. Throughout the war, the Russian army suffers huge losses, but the army keeps rebuilding its ranks because the country had an enormous population. So, for more than 3 years, this Russian army that was battered and bruised managed to tie up hundreds of thousands of German troops in the east. And as a result, Germany could take its full army against the West. It couldn't take its full army against the West because the Russians were keeping them occupied. So there's the Eastern Front, line between Germany and Russia, or in this case, technically Poland, but it's a very large front. And the fact that Germany had to spend uh, hundreds of thousands, they had to leave hundreds of thousands of people over here. Well, that means that's hundreds of thousands that aren't fighting over here. Eventually, it became obvious to everybody involved that this simply had to be what we call a total war. In other words, like right now in the United States, we're involved in a number of armed conflicts, but we're not in something that would be considered a total war at the moment. What do I mean by that? So, like I said, right now we are involved in wars and skirmishing and fighting, but for most people, life is pretty much business as usual. At least it was. That could be said before the COVID-19 started happening, in terms of just our day to day life, um, I'm certainly not saying it doesn't affect us, but just going about our business, it's pretty much the impact is very limited on just your everyday American when I'm talking about just lifestyle. So, this idea of a total war is the opposite of that. It's where all of a nation's resources, not only their resources, but their people as well, it's where all of them and all of it has to be mobilized, has to be put towards this ultimate effort of defeating the enemy. And we see that a few ways. So there's an economic impact early on. Both sides set up systems to recruit, arm, transport, and supply armies that numbered in the millions. All of the warring nations except Britain imposed universal military conscription. We just call that the draft. And that requires all young men to be ready for military or other service. Germany actually set up a system of forced civilian labor as well. So, similar concept to a draft for the armed forces, but it was just for domestic labor, for labor going on within Germany. At home, governments are raising taxes and borrowing huge amounts of money to pay the costs of war. They had to ration food and other products, from everything from boots to gasoline. And they introduced other economic controls like setting prices and forbidding strikes. Propaganda is another part of total war, and that is because it's meant to control public opinion and keeping the public supportive of what you're doing, especially if it's something where people are going to die. That's important that you keep the public on your side. Even in democratic countries, special boards censor the press to an extent. Excuse me. Yeah, even in democratic countries, they censored the press. One of the main aims of them censoring the press was to keep casualty numbers out of the news. In other words, they didn't want um, people to be reading, oh my gosh, 300,000 people died. That would be a surefire way to lose support. So they tried to limit discouraging news from reaching the people. And they even started to restrict popular literature, certain historical writings, some movies, some arts. Both sides wage this propaganda war. It's just, like I said, the spreading of ideas to promote a cause or to damage an opposing cause. For the Allies, Allied propaganda usually played up or often played up Germany's invasion of Belgium as being like this barbarous act, this just horrible thing. So the British and the French press, they circulate tales of all these atrocities or horrible acts against innocent people. Sometimes those stories were greatly exaggerated, other times they're completely made up. For women, total war meant governments turned to them for help like we had never seen before. Thousands of women replaced men in factories, offices, shops. Women build tanks and munitions. They plow fields, pave streets, run hospitals. They keep troops supplied with food, clothing, and weapons. Although most women left the workforce when the war ended, they did change many people's views on what women were capable of doing. And women, although they weren't in the infantry with a machine gun, they did sometimes work on the front lines. I think I said erroneously earlier that they weren't on the front lines. What I meant was they weren't infantry women, but they worked as nurses. So nurses often were put in harm's way. My point is, ladies, you really stepped up when we needed you to. Oops. If you could, we won't take the time to count them all out, but if you count them, there were roughly 20 countries in the entire world who were not involved in this. Other things are happening in Russia as well. 3 years of war had hit Russia especially hard, and people were telling stories of these incompetent generals and just corruption. So public confidence was pretty much gone. In March 1917, we get some bread riots, basically. Bread riots in St. Petersburg, Russia, that eventually like turn into a revolution that brings down the Russian monarchy. At first, the Allies welcomed the overthrow of the Tsar because they hoped that Russia would institute a democracy and would become a stronger ally. But later that year, a guy named Vladimir Lenin came to power, and he promises to pull Russian troops out of the war. Like in 1918, early 1918, Lenin signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. That officially ended Russian participation in the war. So it turns out that the Russian monarch being overthrown was not that great, at least in terms of what it meant for our numbers, the Allies' numbers in the war. And if you look here, remember when we talked about the Eastern Front and Russia and why they were so important, we said that one of the reasons was there were roughly 300,000 German soldiers on the East. So once Russia signs this treaty with Germany, those German troops can go back to the West. So Germany gets this like new influx of troops out on the Western Front. All right, enough horsing around. Time for the U.S. to enter the war. There are rules of war and laws of war that have to be followed. And when you break those rules, that's called a war crime. One war crime is to sink a passenger ship, a non military ship. So, January 1917, the Germans announced that their submarines would sink any ship in the waters around Britain without warning. And the policy was called unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans had tried that before. They tried that policy before. On May 7th, 1915, a German submarine or U boat had sunk the British passenger ship Lusitania. It was fully submerged underwater in just 18 minutes. And more importantly, it resulted in the loss of over 1,000 lives, about 1,200 lives. About 100 of those were children, and important for the U.S., 128 of those were Americans. Germans' defense of their actions, other than just saying basically "we told you so," was they claimed that the ship was carrying ammunition, that it was basically they were carrying war material on a ship with civilians. In 2006, a dive team, a team of scuba divers, discovered 15,000 rounds of ammo. In other words, the Allies were lying. What? We didn't send ammunition. That was passengers. No, it turns out they actually were carrying ammunition. So the American public is absolutely outraged. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of this class, up until this point, a lot of Americans were perfectly happy um, not being involved in the war. But once you take down 128 um, citizens, suddenly America has more interest in stepping up and fighting. So the American public's outraged. Woodrow Wilson, who's president then, sends a protest letter to Germany. And after two more attacks, the Germans finally agree to stop attacking neutral ships and passenger ships. But when they started getting desperate, the Germans, they returned to unrestricted submarine warfare. And that was in 1917. They knew that that might lead to a war with the US, but they gambled that their naval blockade would starve Britain into defeat before the US could even mobilize. Did you guys follow that? So the Germans were a little bit wary of getting in a war with the United States, but the Germans thought that they would defeat Britain quickly enough that the US more or less wouldn't be able to declare war in time. And ignoring those warnings from President Wilson, German U boats sink three American ships. This is the ultimate. I don't know if you've ever meant to send a text message to one person and you send it to another one, and it's possible maybe even you were talking trash about the person who you sent the text to. You know, you send a text, you think you're sending it to your sister. You say, God, mom's the worst. You actually send it to mom. Well, figure that times a billion. That's the Zimmerman telegram. February 1917, another German action pushes the United States closer to war. And that is they actually intercept a telegram written by the Foreign Secretary of Germany, a guy named Arthur Zimmerman. And Zimmerman says he's going to help Mexico reconquer the land it lost to the United States if Mexico would ally itself with Germany. So the Germans literally sent a telegram to Mexico and said, hey, we'll help you if you attack America. They wanted an enemy, they wanted us to have an enemy right on our border. And that was the last straw. At this point, a larger portion of the American population already favored the Allies. In fact, in particular, we feel a bond with England. We share a common ancestry and language, as well as other similar democratic institutions and legal systems. More importantly, our economic ties with the Allies were far stronger than our economic ties with the Central Powers. That makes a big difference. We've said it all year long. Money is going to play a role to some extent in just about everything that we're studying. All right. Okay, so we've made it all the way to our declaration of war, Woodrow Wilson's famous speech. And we're just about at our 30-minute mark. So I'm going to stop there and we'll talk about that tomorrow. So good job, guys. Keep it up. We're halfway through our third week, doing a great job. Hope everybody's doing well, staying safe. Be nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents crazy. Talk to you later.